Well, great pleasure to be back with you for the last of my series of lectures on the volunteer movements. And tonight I want to look at the role of women and the volunteer movements, so a theme that runs through most of the groups I've looked at, though not the young citizen volunteers of Ireland that didn't have any female members from what we can work out or associated body. I have some nice photographs to show you later on if we can get the computer to play with us this week. We weren't having much luck last week, but we should have the press on anyway. We can say that the period 1912-1916 marks something of a halfway point in women's struggle for political rights and for citizenship as opposed to economic rights, which comes much later, of course. In 1898, local government reform had meant that most women in Ireland had the vote for council elections, but of course it was to be 1918 before women could vote in general elections, and 1928 until their franchise at general elections was on the same basis as men. So in the background to the volunteer movements and Irish politics of the period, we have a much wider issue of the suffragist and suffragette movements, which I'll say a bit about later on. In sort of military terms, if we're thinking about the role of women in the military, it's fair to say that even today women have complete equality in very few military forces. One of the very rare examples would be the Israeli army. In the British Army, for example, at present, women can't join frontline units, which are defined as infantry or armoured units. They can join Royal Artillery units, rather strangely. But of course, in the modern counterinsurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan, women have found themselves in the front line, so that hasn't worked out quite as planned in terms of defining women as a non-combatant role. Before the First World War, the women's role in the British Army was largely as nurses. Of course, we all think of Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War in 1854 with that innovation. And as nurses, they were in base hospitals that were miles behind the front line, so the idea was to keep women away from the firing lines. When the Hamilton reforms came in Britain between 1906 and 1908, establishing, amongst other things, a territorial force, what was set up in Britain on independent initiative was something called the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, and this was a rather exclusive ladies' outfit mounted on horseback, which offered first aid to troops, and the idea was that they could keep up with the firing. Now, they could keep up with cavalry charges is one of the ideas, which shows us some of the ideas of military thinkers then, but that they could at least keep up with infantry lines as they advanced. Now, it's interesting that the War Office doesn't support the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry at that point. They do endorse them when the First World War breaks out, but then they're used essentially as nurses in base hospitals. They only define a more interesting role in the Second World War, when the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry is the basis for a lot of female agents who go into the Special Operations Executive when it's set up in 1940. So again, we get this idea of women's groups that want to have a more active role, but the War Office holding back on that in the Edwardian period. During the First World War itself, then, there is an expansion or development of the women's role in the British Army, but again it's very much in the idea of a non-combatant role. The Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps is formed over 1916-1917. This, of course, in the context of conscription, so the manpower issue or people power issue was becoming very intense at that point, so there was the firm view that if women could relieve men of certain duties, then that would help to solve that problem. Having said that, the number of women that served in the British Army in the Great War wasn't vast, something like 40,000 in Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps, and again it's very much this idea of non-combatant duties, so it's not nursing in their case, but it is clerical and driving duties, so nothing combatant if you do get caught up in fighting when the front line breaks in the German offensive in March and April 1918, but that's by accident rather than design. No woman that served in the British Army in this period held a commission which allowed them to command men, so the women's units had their own rank structures, and it was very much a separate auxiliary organisation from the British Army proper. So in that context of how the British military viewed women, it's not a surprise that the volunteer movements in Ireland between 1912 and 1916 tended to view women very much as auxiliaries. The notable exception to that is the ReCitizens Army, where women were treated with something approaching equality, although I think other historians have tended to be a little bit too excited at this, that still in the ReCitizens Army they are doing nursing jobs, cooking jobs, dispatch jobs. It's not firing right from the front line with one exception. Constance Markovich, who I'll be saying a fair bit more about in tonight's lecture, who has some claims to have been a deputy commander at the ICI, ReCitizens Army Garrison at St Stephen's Green during the Easter Rising. Constance Markovich, of course, committed feminist, goes on to be the first woman elected to a seat in the House of Commons, but of course as a Sinn Féin member never took up the seat, so that's why this Lady Astor is the name we hear of more in that context. So I'll turn firstly to talk about women within unionism and the relationship with the Ulster Volunteer Force. Unionism and conservatism more generally are not thought of as particularly forward-thinking in terms of women's rights. The common view was that Unionists thought that women's only role at political meetings was to provide the tea and sandwiches, and that's possibly something that goes on to this day. But the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was set up as the female equivalent of the Unionist Constitutional Associations and the Unionist Clubs on the 23rd of January 1911. The Unionist associations were obviously involved in selecting candidates for Parliament, so women weren't involved in that. The Unionist Clubs movement was resurrected through 1911 on throughout the Home Rule crisis, and it had much more of a social base and a more mass organisation than the Unionist association, so probably the link as the Ulster Women's Unionist Council is more like the Unionist Clubs than the Unionist associations. It was immediately a popular movement, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council. It's thought that by January 1912, so within a year of its formation, that it had somewhere between 115,000 and 200,000 members. The disparity, the disparity in those figures shows you again how the press tended to play up the various organisations. So, nationalist newspapers tending to downplay numbers, unionist papers tending to overestimate. But still, even if we go for the lower figure there, that's a pretty impressive political mobilisation, which practically any political party in the UK would give their right arm for now. The link between the Ulster Women's Unionist Council and the Unionist Party proper was not quite as firm as it could have been. It becomes much firmer after the First World War. In 1918, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council gets seats on the Ulster Unionist Council, which of course was the decision and policy making body for the Ulster Unionist Party. They don't have that before the First World War, so the links are more sort of personal to do with who their president is and their deference to Edward Carson, and institutional links with the rest of unionism. When the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was set up, the organisation explicitly refused to discuss any topic but the union at its meetings. And that meant that the whole pro and anti-suffrage question didn't raise its head, because within Irish unions at that time you could find both sides of the argument. People will hopefully correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Carson is seen largely as being anti-suffrage. He certainly heckled at a couple of the major unionist demonstrations, whereas James Craig, I think, was more in favour of women's suffrage, so that there is some sort of tension at the top there. And of course we have the Duchess of Abercorn, who's the first leader of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, their first president, who argues against women having the vote. So that even within the ranks of women there were some that didn't follow what we would think of as a fairly obvious feminist agenda. The Ulster Women's Unionist Council then established itself very early on as a very active organisation. The impression that women were simply at meetings to make the tea and sandwiches is entirely wrong. In some areas they've looked at, particularly in Cavan and South Antrim, it seems to have been the Ulster Women's Unionist Council and its local branches rather than the Unionist Clubs which took the lead in organising political events. And at some of these events they did get some of the big names in. So in County Cavan, the women's organisation there gets James Craig down to give a speech, a fairly important one about how they can rely on support from unionists elsewhere in Ulster if Home Rule comes through. They also have Ronald McNeil, who's a pretty impressive platform speaker, to talk to them. So women's groups are quite active within unionism and are doing sort of really mainstream political activity. It's not simply supportive work, it does seem to be taking the initiative in a number of areas. During the Covenant campaign itself in 1912, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council organises the Women's Declaration, which supports the Covenant, and that's thought to gain rather more signatures than the Covenant itself, which is a testament to the organising ability and the infrastructure of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council. The Irish Unionist Alliance figure that they released in October 1912 said that 218,206 men had signed the Covenant and 228,991 women had signed the Declaration. So you can get some idea from that just how much work was involved in distributing copies of the Declaration and setting up places for people to sign and posting out documents. So that shows quite a lot of good sort of clerical work and organisation. The leadership of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was very posh, as already alluded to that. The first president was the second Duchess of Abercorn between 1911 and 1913, and she was succeeded by the 6th Marchioness of Londonderry between 1913 and 1919. And obviously women who are elected essentially on the basis of who their husbands are, so nothing particularly empowering or radical there. But it seems that a lot of the membership of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council were working class women. The West Belfast branch claims to have 3,000 members on its books, many of them women mill workers, among some of the worst paid in Ulster at the time. So quite a varying group of people involved, or women involved in this movement. We now turn to the question about how militant the Ulster Women's Unionist Council was. I had hoped at this point to show you a nice photograph or two, but this seems to have died again, but we'll come back to that in a moment. We can say that the organisation, the Ulster Women's Unionist Council, was not expressly militant in either Ulster Unionist terms or in feminist terms. And if we think about the text of the declaration that's made to support the Covenant, it makes no specific mention of militant action by women. I'll just read out the declaration text to you, thanks. It says, "We whose names are underwritten, women of Ulster and loyal subjects of our gracious King, being firmly persuaded that Home Rule would be disastrous to our country, desire to associate ourselves with the men of Ulster in their uncompromising opposition to the Home Rule Bill now before Parliament, whereby it is proposed to drive Ulster out of her cherished place in the Constitutional United Kingdom and to place her under the domination and control of a Parliament in Ireland. Praying that from this calamity God will save Ireland, we hereto subscribe our names." So nothing very much there. We're getting that women will associate themselves with their menfolk, not that they will stand shoulder to shoulder with them or anything that would sound more militaristic there. And then the only activity that said women will do is pray. So nothing that we'd think of there as being particularly militant and fitting into that agenda within unionism. Carson, when he was asked about the role of the Women's Council in the worsening crisis, this is in June 1914, gave his opinion that women should concentrate on what was talked about at that time as missionary activity. It's what we think of now as propaganda, and this was both to try and convert holiday makers, particularly in Portrush and Port Stewart, where a lot of people from Glasgow came for their holidays then, and also to send women over to help at by-elections in Great Britain. About 40 women go over to help Conservative candidates in election campaigns in Britain, some of them only going for a few days, some of them going for 6 weeks, and really stumping the platforms and pushing the Irish Unionist cause there. Beyond that, Carson says that they should be involved in raising money for what's called the Carson Fund. The Carson Fund was to provide money for propaganda purposes, so posters, leaflets and so on. So it's interesting that even in fundraising, it's for printed material rather than for rifles. And we see that's a slightly different agenda than we see with the Irish Volunteers. Now, you might get a false impression of how militant women had actually been, and I did dig these out. This is from the Belfast Telegraph's photograph collection to do with the anniversary of the Covenant, last year, the centenary anniversary, which some of you may have seen on TV or indeed taken part in. So here we have a woman here parading as a female member of the Ulster Volunteer Force. An obvious problem in that there was no female element within the Ulster Volunteer Force of that sort. There was the separate nursing corps, there was the separate dispatch riding corps. So the idea that women were marching with their menfolk carrying rifles is mistaken. There was another woman on the parade too who it appears like this. Now I think that's actually an allusion to a propaganda poster, a propaganda postcard of the time, which is deserted I can stand alone. So I think that's trying to bring up a rather different idea than the first one. The only contemporary one I could find of women looking sort of armed and dangerous is this one here, which is a small family group from East Belfast, where the women have presumably got their men folks bandoliers and bayonets and so on, and have posed with their young son. So whenever we're looking at this, there's a rather false impression of just how militant women were. What women were principally involved in was the nursing corps, and there's a picture of some of the great and the good of Ulster Unionism as nurses. And the other key one is to do with signalling and dispatch. I would find that. Yes, it's a very good one there. It's again most of these photographs from the PRONI collection. You can see that what you have in the middle here, the women with the sort of sticks here are signallers, and those in the back row are from the post office, post house system. This is if the Ulster Provisional Government was declared that the Ulster Provisional Government, the Ulster Volunteer Force, would have its own postal network that they could use rather than having to rely on the telegraph system and so on. So you've got the dispatch rider element, the signalling element, the post house element, and you see women are quite firmly represented there. If we're thinking at the sort of top of the Ulster Provisional Government's UVF organisation of the period, there were 3 women members of the UVF Medical Board, and there was a postmistress who was head of the post house network. So both important roles that certainly if the Provisional Government had been declared would have been crucial in trying to maintain communications and deal with casualties. The UVF Nursing Corps, though, had to be formed essentially from scratch, and this again brings us back to a recurring theme in this series of lectures about the failure of the British government to bring the territorial force scheme into Ireland at the same time as the rest of Great Britain in 1908. What you had in Britain by 1911-1912 were a large number of what were called voluntary aid detachments. These had been set up of volunteer women nurses in most towns and cities in Britain, even some small villages in fact, and they had been organised by the Red Cross movement, so recognised by the War Office, territorial associations, and organised by the Red Cross. That hadn't been transferred to Ireland, and there were problems with going along another route. When the nurses' units were being set up, there was thought of using the St John's ambulance movement to provide training, but that didn't work out. I'm not entirely sure what the reasons for that were, or the principal reasons. Some correspondence talks about the St John's ambulance courses being too theoretical and lasting too long, that it took 3 months for someone to be trained as a St John's ambulance nurse, but there's other suggestions that there's a problem with the aims of the St John's ambulance body and the aims of the UVF Nursing Corps, so there's obviously a sort of political conflict within that as well. When women joined the Nursing Corps, they filled out a nurses volunteer form, and this fairly obviously, I suppose, asked for name, address, occupation, what nursing certificates they had and what nursing experience they had. But it then had a declaration for them to sign, and this I think is interesting because of course those who were joining the Ulster Volunteer Force were meant to have signed a covenant before doing so. And of course, some of them sign the covenant immediately before they join the UVF. They're able to do it retrospectively. But in that context, the declaration that female nurses are asked to sign is an interesting one. It reads, "I, the undersigned, being over 18 years of age and being a member of the whatever Women's Unionist Association, agree to serve in the Ulster Volunteer Medical Aid Nursing Corps throughout the crisis created by the passage into law of the Home Rule Bill at present before Parliament or in any previous emergency. I hereby covenant unreservedly to place my services at the disposal of the Corps and to yield a cheerful obedience to the command of my superior officers." So that interesting use of the term covenant there. So women couldn't sign the covenant, but this seems to have put them on a sort of equal basis in those terms with those men who'd signed the covenant and then joined the Ulster Volunteer Force. We have a photograph of nurses here from Tyrone, we think. Well, yes, right, that's somewhere in Tyrone. And that gives you some idea of what sort of numbers were attending some of these nursing courses and how local groups were formed up. This group presumably one of those that was going to take over this house that's behind them in the event of trouble, and then that would be the temporary hospital. The nursing classes were held under the auspices of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council starting in May 1913 and were properly centralised under the Council in October 1913. And it's quite a significant number of people that were trained through these. Not all those that were trained seem to have been female, but we can imagine that most were. From October 1913 to May 1914, there were 141 first aid classes organised and 64 home nursing classes. So that meant that you had 4,881 people instructed in first aid, and certificates of proficiency were awarded to 3,129 of those. There were then a further 1,916 people instructed in home nursing, and of those 1,566 were granted certificates. So quite high numbers going through these schemes. Nancy Keenan, in her study of the Ulster Women's Unionist Council published in the 1970s, stated that the Ulster Volunteer Force Nursing Corps was about 3,520 strong, so that does yield quite positive results. I think I have a photograph of one of the classes here. Yes, there we are. So this is looks to be a class being held in a schoolroom. You can see the map of the UK there and so on. So this is the idea of the first class. I think first aid classes, I think everyone in that photograph is a woman, so we can assume that most of those that go through the first aid classes are women. Some other photographs in the Cooper collection do show you ambulance units where you do have quite a lot of men, but I think they are the stretcher bearers and those that are organising the transport side of things rather than the nursing and first aid itself. There were a few examples of more militant women, but they are very few. The principal one that we have an account of is Lillian Spender, whose husband, Captain Wilfred Spender, was a staff officer with the Ulster Volunteer Force. She and a few of her friends, again, they're all middle-class women from what we can make out, persuaded a member of the UVF headquarters to instruct them in the use of a revolver. But that seems to be about it, really. There doesn't seem to have been any more militant aspects like that elsewhere in the country. In terms of how nurses paraded, this is something that is worth thinking about too. We can see here there's a mock-up cannon there. I think this is Portadown on the first anniversary of the Covenant, so September 1913. In the middle of between the nurses there is a mocked-up cannon, which unfortunately hasn't come out there very clearly. But you can see there the nurses are put in the front row, so obviously seen as important within Unionism. There's also a Boy Scout lurking there somewhere, so something there about the sort of different age ranges and gender groups and so on involved. The other one, yes, that seems to be, there's some hats they have, their hats seem to be covered with white covers there, whether it's meant to look like United States Marine Corps like milkmen, I don't know, but it's a very funny effect. So you have, that's what most of the hats are, but there's a couple of ones on the right I think that are Boy Scouts hats, or those sort of Boer War slouch hats type things, so quite strange what they're up to there. Otherwise we do get a few examples of women actually parading, the Nurses Corps actually parading. Now, we're not sure where this one's from. The other one that I've seen is a parade in Monaghan in June 1914 in New Bliss. And I think that what's going on in the Monaghan parade is basically an attempt to swell numbers. That the UVF regiment down there was about 2,000 strong, the Nursing Corps was another couple of hundred, so with them tacked on to the parade it looked a bit more impressive. And I think that this might be for Monaghan or Cavan as well. That's what you get there. In Belfast, that's not the dynamic you see so much. Sorry, I'm playing about it with the fleas, I think that's what I'm after. Yes, we have here, I think that this is the big Balmoral demonstration. It's to do with the first anniversary of the Covenant, and you can see there that the nurses are part of the audience, so they're sort of lining the route, looking on rather than taking part in the parade itself. So I think that where you had strong unionist majorities, then it was men on parade, but I think that in areas where the unionists were in a pretty small minority, then the women came out in parade as well to essentially swell the numbers and show their support. In terms of the Ulster Unionist Council approach to things, that the sort of ideology that they espoused wasn't really that much different to Ulster Unionism, Irish Unionism as a whole. One of the few exceptions we have to that is what the Lurgan branch of the Women's Council passes. In May 1911 they pass a resolution which says, if our homes are not sacred from the priest under the existing laws, what can we expect from a priest governing Ireland? Home is a woman's first consideration. In the event of home rule being granted, the sanctity and happiness of home life in Ulster would be permanently destroyed. So an idea there of linking very much their political ideology to their home life, and also introducing the religious element, which of course a lot of unionist leaders weren't terribly keen to talk about on public platforms, thinking of consumption in GB and further afield. During the First World War then, the Nursing Corps provides staff for the UVF hospital in Pau in France. Given this is Tyrone nurses, it seems that it's the Tyrone Nursing Corps that was the best organised within the Ulster Volunteer Force, and they seem to form the basis of the group that goes out to Pau in France. The women's movement also had a role in recruiting men for the army, for the Ulster Division, and also raised £100,000 for the Ulster Women's Gift Fund for Soldiers, it was called, along which went to prisoners of war. So there's quite a lot of activity being carried out by the women's movement during the war, but of course there is a political truce, and the Ulster Unionist Council itself meets very periodically during the war. We can also probably say that the Ulster Unionist Council, these nursing units, dispatch units and so on, provide some sort of template for what Lady Londonderry sets up pretty soon after the start of the war. She organises the Women's Legion, which is recognised by the War Office, which starts off providing female cooks for military depots, so freeing up army cooks or men from being cooks to go to the front line, and later develops into clerical duties and transport duties, and seems to survive the war as a transport outfit. Parts of it seem to be submerged in Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps. The paperwork of that's all here at PRONI if anyone wants to look into that. So it's quite an interesting topic that hasn't been gone through properly yet. I'll turn now then to Irish volunteers and women's involvement with them. A major book to mention here is Cal McCarthy's important book on the Come the Ban movement, Come the Ban and the Irish Revolution, from which I'm drawing quite a lot of what I'm saying today. As with the Ulster Volunteer Force, no woman was a member of the Irish Volunteers. They couldn't enlist in the Irish Volunteers on the same basis as men. And you'll remember a few weeks ago I talked about the great inaugural meeting of the Irish Volunteers at the Rotunda Rink in November 1913. At that meeting a number of women were present, but they were seated separately. Margaret Ward, female historian of women's issues, has argued that this was symbolic of their relegation to a passive and observant role. She thinks that very much sets up the dynamic for women's relationships with the Irish Volunteers. The Volunteer Manifesto that's issued by the Irish Volunteers is a bit ambiguous. It says, There will also be work for the women to do, and there are signs that the women of Ireland, true to their record, are especially enthusiastic for the success of the volunteers. We propose for the volunteer organisation the widest possible base. So that suggested that there was going to be some sort of women's organisation set up pretty quickly, but the whole message of that is rather deflated by what's said at the Rotunda Rink, where platform speaker after platform speaker talks about Irishmen and the manhood of Ireland informing the volunteer movement, so the women's interests seem to be neglected at that point. So there's a number of sort of parents to the Come to Ban movement that isn't then formed until April 1914, which is essentially the Women's Auxiliary of the Irish Volunteers. It seems that at the Rotunda meeting itself in November 1913, Con Colbert took the names of women who attended with the view that they would be contacted later to be organised in some shape or form. Kathleen Clark, wife of Tom Clark, leading figure in the Irish Republican Brotherhood, said that the IRB were instrumental in organising women. So again, the idea that they were working behind the scenes in Come to Ban the same way they were working behind the scenes for the Irish Volunteers. And Thomas McDonell certainly seems to have been involved from the Irish Republican Brotherhood in mobilising women. Jenny Wise Power, who later becomes president of Come to Ban, said that there was a lot of independent work going on by women in support of the Irish Volunteers and helping with recruiting and supplies and so on in the months after their formation. And Jenny Wise Power also said that many women were looking to the Ulster Women's Unionist Council as a model for them to follow with their relationship with the Irish Volunteers. Some platform speakers for the Irish Volunteers publicly spoke of women forming a nursing corps and of raising £2 million for rifles, and that would be their main contribution. So rather than joining the Irish Volunteers itself, acting as an auxiliary in those two important ways. So the Come to Ban movement is then formed to mobilise female support and formalise that support for the Irish Volunteers and for Home Rule. The inaugural meeting was held in Wynn's Hotel in Dublin on the 2nd of April 1914, and it's then reported in the Irish Volunteer sort of in-house newspaper of the 18th of April, so making the formation of Come to Ban known throughout the country amongst Irish Volunteers. The original meeting was not particularly auspicious in a number of ways. The nationalist press talked about a packed meeting. The Irish Times said that there were 100 ladies present. I'm not quite sure how many people you could pack into one of the rooms at Wynn's Hotel at the time, but if 100 is a bit of an underestimate, we can't imagine that it was really much more than 200. And a lot of those present were essentially sort of middle class ladies from Dublin. It doesn't seem to have penetrated into the rest of the country because the press advertising was very poor. There is an advance notice about it in the Irish Volunteer, which manages to mix up the dates, so people could have turned up at Wynn's Hotel on the Sunday following the meeting and expected to be attending the inaugural meeting of it. And there's no advertisement in the Freeman's Journal, the major nationalist organ for the island of Ireland. The inaugural meeting was also held on a Thursday at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, which of course was incredibly inconvenient for any working woman to attend, so that there are all sorts of problems with that original meeting. The inaugural meeting in Wynn's Hotel is presided over by Agnes O'Farrelly, who was an academic, held an MA at that stage, and was later become a professor at UCD, I think. She saw the Come to Ban in a supportive role, very much helping to fund and equip the Irish Volunteers, so she was quite happy to relegate women into this supportive role, and that view was very much endorsed by the first constitution that was issued for Come to Ban. This constitution declared the aims of the new movement to be 1, to advance the cause of Irish liberty, 2, to organise Irish women in the furtherance of this object, 3, to assist in arming and equipping a body of Irishmen for the defence of Ireland, and 4, to form a fund for these purposes to be called the Defence of Ireland Fund. So obviously a rather subservient role there. And some feminists voiced concern about where the movement was going as early as the inaugural meeting at Wynn's Hotel. One speaker at the inaugural meeting said that women should be trained to fight, that they shouldn't simply have this subservient role, and went on to say that they could do splendid work as spies. What type of Mata Hari arrangement she was thinking of there, we can only guess at. Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, who was a founder of the Irish Women's Franchise League, voiced her concerns at a Cumnaban meeting at Mansion House, Dublin, on the 2nd of May 1914, which was one of their first big public recruiting meetings. And she voiced her concerns that the movement didn't put the equality of women first. She asked how any women's movement could have that as something down the list of priorities, that wouldn't be the very first issue on their agenda. Well, Farley, who chaired the first meeting, tried to make the Cumnaban non-political in the same way as the Ulster Unionist Council, sort of tried to leave off all these debates about suffrage matters and so on, but with rather less success. It was an issue that kept coming up at meetings and retarded the growth of the movement. As with the Ulster Unionist Council, some of the senior figures in Cumnaban were largely there because of the fame of their husbands or their husbands' connections. So Agnes McNeill was a founder member, Will McNeill's wife, the leader of the Irish Volunteers. Nancy O'Reilly was there, wife of Michael O'Reilly, known as the O'Reilly, an advanced separatist, to be famous for his role in the Easter Rising. Other women had a long history of political involvement that were attended the inaugural meetings. Jenny Wise-Power, that I've already mentioned briefly, was a veteran of the Ladies' Land League and the Irish Women's Franchise League, so a long established political pedigree. Another woman that's involved in the original committee of the Cumnaban was Mary Collum, who was a teacher at Pearse's St Enda's School, so it seems to be that personal relationship with Patrick Pearse that had her involved. One figure that isn't involved that we might think of fairly readily when thinking of women in the Irish Revolution is Constance Markovich. She wasn't on the provisional committee of Cumnaban because she was involved with the ReCitizens Army and didn't think that she could reconcile the two. She later falls out with Cumnaban, but we'll come to that shortly. The early expansion of Cumnaban then is largely in Dublin, and they start off by subsuming a group called the Daughters of Harem, which had been formed in 1800 and was very much based around cultural nationalism. Spent a lot of energies teaching Irish to children and organising what were deemed to be Irish entertainments. So that group is brought in, and we can see then the sort of cultural nationalist wing being brought in there, just as the Irish Volunteers bring in quite a lot of members from the GAA, so the Cumnaban have that relationship with the Daughters of Harem. Otherwise, the Cumnaban expanded fairly slowly, and there is really a question about the extent to which it ever really managed to establish itself as an all-Ireland body. A lot of the expansion seems to have been Dublin-based. McCarthy, in his work on the Cumnaban, reckons that the Irish Volunteer tended to overestimate the membership of the movement. By July 1914, the Cumnaban movement claimed to have 30 branches. By October 1914, they were claiming to have upwards of 60 branches. The imprecision of upwards of 60 is interesting. Throughout 1914-1915, Royal Irish Constabulary reports on the Cumnaban were sparse, and of course the RIC reports are some of the main evidence we've got about the Ulster Volunteers, the Irish Volunteers, and indeed about other movements like the Inchicore Hibernians and the Fianna, the Irish National Boy Scouts movement. These all came to the attention of the police, who reported their numbers relatively accurately from what we can work out. But there are very few such reports on Cumnaban, which suggests both that it's not being organised in large sections of the country, and that where branches were being organised, it was often a small group of women meeting in a private home, so not coming to the attention of the police, that constituted the local branch. One of the few reports we get from the police is from the County Inspector for Kerry, who noted in March 1915 in his monthly report to the Inspector General, Miss McCarthy of Dungarvan visited the county and delivered lectures of a pro-German anti-recruiting nature at Killarney, Tralee and Dingle. She formed branches of Cumnaban in Tralee and Dingle. So the idea that nothing was really happening in Kerry, which we would think of as a fairly advanced nationalist area, until the speaker came in from outside. In December 1915, even the Irish Volunteer was fairly downbeat, saying in many parts of the country the women are still inactive, and Cumnaban themselves hoped that their Flag Day in February 1916 would raise awareness of the movement. Strangely, it seems that Cumnaban branches were more readily established outside Ireland than within it. It's pretty clear that by the end of 1914, there were Cumnaban branches in Liverpool, Glasgow, London and Manchester, and they were also some of the most militant. It seems that those that were involved in the Glasgow and London branches of Cumnaban were involved in very early gun running for the Irish Volunteers, so quite interesting that the expat community seems to have been more militant and more organised than that within Ireland itself, but possibly looking at the Irish Republican Brotherhood, that shouldn't surprise us too much. A Cumnaban convention was held in Dublin in October 1915, and this is interesting for a number of reasons. The first one is that only 13 branches were actually represented. So here we had a movement that a year before had been claiming to have upwards of 60 branches, but only 13 sent delegates along, and only a further 5 branches sent a letter along to say that, terribly sorry, they'd love to be there, but they couldn't quite manage it. So this didn't suggest a movement that was in particularly rude health. The other important element to that convention is that it becomes more radical, in that they elect the movement's first president. It had only been a provisional committee before this, but they elect as the first president Jenny Wise Power, so the long-standing advanced separatist, and as vice president Nancy O'Reilly, wife of Michael O'Reilly, so very radical nationalist figures. And that very firmly then puts the Cumnaban movement in the Irish Volunteers camp, in the split between the Irish National Volunteers and the Irish Volunteers, though a lot of that had been obvious as long ago as November 1914. In November 1914, Agnes O'Reilly had tried to patch up tensions within Cumnaban over the split, but essentially failed to do so. And then it's explicit in this meeting in October 15 at this convention that Cumnaban was integrally linked with the Irish Volunteers and the very advanced nationalist element. Otherwise, in terms of numbers of Cumnaban, this seems to be very hard to estimate. McCarthy comes up with a very, very wide estimate, but like an auctioneer's estimate almost. He says that in early 1916, Cumnaban had somewhere between 650 and 1700 active members. So a very wide spread, which perhaps gives you an idea of police reports, newspaper reports, but also this great problem of passive membership. Large sections of nationalist Ireland and volunteer movements showed large numbers of sort of non-effective or dormant members. The Ancient Order of Hibernians, for example, has any number of branches that pay their subs ruthlessly every year, but don't actually seem to hold a meeting in the intervening period, so a lot of passive membership there. And of course, as we've seen in things like Ulster Volunteer Force, the Irish National Volunteers, when it came to some of these great sort of drill parades and weekly drills, turnouts were often fairly low. So the same sort of fatigue seems to have set in Cumnaban branches by that point. It's also in October 1915 that Constance Markovich has her pretty public spat with Cumnaban, where she says these ladies' auxiliaries demoralise women. So the idea that women are relegating themselves to this second rank were not really doing much to help themselves. So that's another reason perhaps why Cumnaban wasn't expanding with the vigour that one might have expected. I'll say a little bit now about the ReCitizens Army and women before I go on to look at Women on the Rising, which is where I'll finish tonight. The ReCitizens Army obviously had Constance Markovich as one of its members, and her involvement, that's the uniform she's wearing, is ReCitizens Army, gives us an impression that it was very much open to women and a much more militaristic organisation. But that's to give us a rather false impression of the ReCitizens Army. Many historians have written of the equality in the ReCitizens Army, most recently Fergal McGarry, but bar Markovich, the role of women in the ReCitizens Army was much the same as that in the UVF. They were seen as nurses and cooks and messengers. That was basically the level of their involvement. Markovich herself may have fired shots during the Easter Rising. Maurice Headlam, who was a senior civil servant in Dublin Castle, he rejoiced in the title of Treasury Remembrancer in Dublin Castle, so he was the Treasury's man in Dublin and all all sorts of schemes through the Dublin Castle administration were brought to him to vet first before they were sent on to the Treasury in London. So met with a lot of senior officials in Dublin Castle. He believed that Markovich had shot a policeman with a revolver. I think he reckoned that she had shot him in the back. He wasn't a fan. When he met her, he said that she must have been beautiful once. So not one of the great gallants of her time, and his rather derogatory comments that he makes about her. We have a few witness statements that I mentioned last week from members of the Irish Citizens Army, and one of those is from a woman, Maeve Kavanagh McDowell, and she says that she left the Come the Ban movement because she was disgusted at how subservient it was, the Irish Volunteers, and then joined the Irish Citizens Army. So that's one sense there, that they could join the Irish Citizens Army as full members, although within the movement they were then relegated to these sections that dealt with nursing and so on. So it is a rather absolute definition, I suppose, of being able to join it. If we turn then to Women in the Rising, the numbers involved, I suppose the estimates are variable, as with the number of volunteers as a whole. Mike Foy will probably correct me now, given what he's written about the Easter Rising. Fergal McGarry in his book estimates that about 200 women took part in the Rising, which seems to be rather at the high end. But it does seem that perhaps women were overestimated or overrepresented in the witness statements. There are a lot of Come the Ban witness statements in the Bureau of Military History's collection. There were very differing views by the commanders in Easter Rising about the role of women. Eamon de Valera refused to have any female contingent in his garrison at Boland's Mill, and any that came to volunteer the services were sent away. Thomas McDonell only reluctantly let women into the Jacob's Biscuit factory, protesting, "We haven't made any provision for girls here," when a group of Come the Ban turned up. Otherwise, Tom Clark refused to let his wife serve with him in the GPO, though that seems to be because she was such an important figure within advanced nationalism and the Irish Republican Brotherhood herself, that she had to survive for organisational and for propaganda purposes. And James Connelly had mixed views. Initially he was keen to send his daughters to Rome, supposedly to organise things there, but one imagines something to get them out of the way, but fairly quickly relented. Connelly seems to have been influenced by the small numbers of Irish volunteers and Irish Citizens Army that actually turned out on Easter Monday, and was basically looking around desperately for any extra manpower, womanpower that he could marshal. But it's not until Easter Monday evening, when their leaders had protested at the GPO, that the order was given to mobilise Come the Ban. So that seems to be quite late on the day, whereas the Irish Citizens Army had mobilised men and women together. So again, if you're looking at that idea that the Irish Citizens Army treated men and women equally, that's one of the examples you can look to. Pearse's manifesto to the citizens of Dublin further outlined this idea of gendered roles for women. It read, "There is work for everyone, for men in the firing line and for the women in the provision of food and first aid." So even with the crushing manpower shortages which the rebels faced, women were still limited to these roles of nursing, cooking, and in some cases running the gauntlet of sniper fire to bring messages around Dublin. There are a few examples in the witness statements of women who were rather fed up with all this and seem to have gone home. Being asked to cook for hundreds of men day on day wasn't really what they thought they'd signed up and Come the Ban for, and they simply get out of it. Markovich was the only woman sentenced to death following court-martial after the Rising, but it seems that she offered a fairly dignified defence. You read Bram Barton's book on the courts-martial, which is the most comprehensive and based on the fullest range of documents. Some early accounts of her trial talked about her sort of breaking down and saying that you can't shoot me as a woman, but it does seem that it is a dignified defence that she presents, and the only reason her life is spared is because she is a woman. The British government isn't prepared to sanction her execution. One of the other problems with the court-martial process is that Michael Mallon, who's essentially the Irish Citizens Army commandant at St Stephen's Green, seems to have suggested that actually he was only the deputy commander, that it was really Markovich that was in command, and that seems to have been Mallon's attempt to try and get himself a reprieve, a married man with not much money and a family to think of. There is some rationale for that. So by way of conclusion then, we can say that women's experiences within volunteering were not particularly empowering. Women were, with the possible exception of Constance Markovich, relegated to non-combatant roles and very much supportive auxiliary roles. The movement should be seen, I think, as entirely separate from the suffragette campaign. The Ulster Women's Unionist Council was more successful in keeping the issue of their debates than was the Cumnaban. And Cumnaban didn't really make much of an impact. There is a question to say about whether it actually established itself as an All-Ireland body before the Easter Rising. Post-Rising it becomes rather more significant. And we can see then a very marked difference there. In the Cumnaban, we're thinking of having a very small number of members, less than 2,000. The Ulster Unionist Council were thinking of having perhaps as many as 200,000 members. There's a very absolute difference there. And then this idea of the ReCitizens Army provided some equality about enrolment. It does in theoretical and constitutional terms, in that women could be members of the ReCitizens Army, but then within that army they essentially fulfilled non-combatant roles. So I'll end it there and thank many of you for your forbearance over the past 5 weeks, and hope that you'll buy the book and come to the book launch if PRONI's good enough to host it. So thanks very much, and as always invite your questions now.